We're introducing high degrees of freedom dynamic neural fields and use them to model robot kinematics implicitly. At the core of all actions performed by a robot, there is the kinematic modeler, which the robotics engineer defines to describe how the joints and links interact and are constrained. This imposes a bottleneck on the autonomy robots can acquire over their life cycle, which is within the realm of using forward and inverse kinematics on a given kinematic model. What, however, if the robot is damaged, upgraded, or simply unknown? Here, it is important to give the robot the ability to infer its own kinematics without a human in the loop. This is the objective of robot self-modeling, the robot's ability to learn a model of itself from observing its behavior in the environment. We cast this problem as a conditional 3D reconstruction problem from 2D images. Given 2D images of the robot, learn a model overfit to the scene that takes as input a joint configuration and outputs the shape of the robot in space. Therefore, we go beyond classical end effector kinematics and map joint configuration to full body shape and vice versa. Neural fields, such as NERV, have recently seen ample success in reconstructing static 3D scenes only from 2D images by fitting a continuous coordinate to color and density function. By querying this function at relevant positions, we can reconstruct the entire scene. However, they lack the ability to model articulated objects conditioned on many degrees of freedom, such as kinematics of a robot with moving parts. Thus, we make the following contributions. First, we introduce high degrees of freedom dynamic neural density fields as a new neural architecture. Second, we introduce a data sampling strategy to facilitate learning HDNF. Third, we extend previous work and device integrations of HDNF for kinematics and motion planning tasks. The original NERV work of Mildenhall et al. 2020 reconstructs the static scene from camera post annotated images. Extensions emerged to enable the reconstruction of dynamic scenes, customarily trained from video. While different in approach, they have in common that they condition on a single degree of freedom, which is time. For control-conditioned reconstruction where the degrees of freedom are anchored in parts of the scene, like revolute joints, this is insufficient. Many degree of freedom or articulated neural fields have recently been introduced to solve this. However, they either require prior knowledge about the type of object to articulate with special annotations, or they train on multi-view video. In contrast, our approach to articulated reconstruction only necessitates individual images annotated with the degree of freedom configuration they correspond to without any assumptions. We can thus model any articulated object, including, for instance, soft robots. Thereby, our self-supervised approach goes beyond supervised approaches where the target position is provided in the training data. It also goes beyond recent work by Chen et al. 2022, which learns a signed distance function and requires depth annotated images. At the core of our method is a neural density field, a map from spatial coordinate to density of the scene elements at that coordinate. This map is parameterized by a multilayer perceptron. Given the training set, we use camera poses to sample points on pixel corresponding rays. Their coordinates, together with the joint configurations, form the input to the neural network, which outputs density and, only for the training purpose, color. Using differentiable volumetric rendering, we receive pixel color predictions. Now, we can use the ground truth image to compute a loss, which we use as training signal to update the model. After training, we only use the density predictions of novel configurations for our downstream applications, such as determining whether a configuration is collision-free. To achieve articulated control, we condition the map on all degrees of freedom that inform the observed changes in the scene. For a robot, these are the joint angles. However, learning a 3 plus k dimensional field is challenging, so that we introduce two techniques to help the learning process. First, we avoid the forgetting of well-learned value to shape relationships of individual degrees of freedom by incentivizing them to be learned independently via degree of freedom individual MLP encoders. These can retain information about the degrees of freedom's influence when other degrees of freedom are learned because gradients flowing back to them will be zero. Second, we ease learning the marginal contribution of each degree of freedom by providing training samples with different numbers of active joints. We create those by sampling index sets from the power set of joint indices and randomly sampling joint values only for the index corresponding joints while setting the others to zero. We initially verify our results regarding the general capabilities of the learned neural field in 3D reconstruction. We successfully conditioned the robot's shape in space on its joint configuration, which allows us to query it in unseen configurations with an average chamfer distance of 2% of the workspace dimension. We can also change the view of those reconstructions. However, the volumetric rendering incentivizes a non-smooth surface. We now demonstrate how the visually acquired self-model instead of a classical kinematic model can be used by the robot for classical motion planning. We extend the work of Chen et al. 2022 and introduce two approaches. First, we leverage the differentiable nature of our architecture to optimize the input joint values, effectively performing numerical inverse kinematics. For this purpose, we optimize to minimize the loss, which corresponds to touching a known object. This is modeled as a minimum robot density on any of the surface points. By setting start and end of the trajectory as start and end of the optimization and constraining the value updates, this process is cast as a valid trajectory. However, this approach can converge to local optima. Thus, in the presence of obstacles and constraints, we use our second approach, which uses the learned self-model as a query model for the configuration space in concert with classical motion planning algorithms. If a joint configuration produces a maximum density over points in the volume of known obstacles that exceeds a threshold, this joint configuration will produce a collision and is rejected. By repeatedly querying configurations, we can find a path from start to end via algorithms such as rapidly exploring random trees. In summary, we introduce high degrees of freedom dynamic neural fields, a method for articulated 3D reconstruction of objects from individual 2D images without prior knowledge about the shape and function. Using HDNF for robot self-modeling allows the robot to learn its own kinematics implicitly from images, which brings us a step closer towards end-to-end autonomy. Our method is integrated with downstream motion planning, and any robot with camera access can learn it. We foresee applications also outside robotics, which would benefit from extensions regarding environment actor integrated models, fewer training data, better generalization, and latent space controllability.